Okay, now we're good.
There we go.
Yeah.
Call to order, Citizen Finance Advisory Committee on Tuesday, March 11th at 6:34. Can I do a roll call?
Mr. Arbogast,
Here.
Mr. Brisbane,
Here.
Mr. Kowski, Mr. Davis,
Here.
Dr. Fiorenzo, Ms. Guerrero. Here. Mr. Adams.
Here.
Counselor,
Here.
Mr. Kohler,
Here.
Mr. Miller,
Here.
Dr. Odell. Here.
The motion to approve the of February. December. I was thinking, I was like, oh, December. December 10th. There we go. December 10th, 2024. Motion. Second. There was Cal and Steve. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? No, motion carries. Next up is public comment.
We have none.
You have that online or nothing?
No.
No, all right.
Nobody- They don't want us.
No, they don't.
Enjoy the vacation while we listen.
That brings up item 6A, the financial dashboard and peer district discussion. Graham, which one do you want to take that?
I'll intro it and then kick it over. We have been at work between the last two meetings, developing the charting for the financial dashboard that will ultimately live on the website with the feedback that was provided from our last discussion. In that as well, there's been a refinement of our peer districts. And I will go ahead and kick it over to Graham to lead some of the conversation on where we're at.
Okay, so just from a background standpoint, this is something that Tom Kowski, myself, and Steve worked on dating back to December. And the principle here is that every school district should have appropriate peers in whatever topic or arena you're talking about, this case being financial. And the benefits of that you can all easily guess. We want to always have good benchmarks, good data references for how we're spending money, good comparisons that we can use to benchmark ourselves against and then help to guide decisions. Now, apparently, if you go back at least to 2022, there had been a set of peers that were being used. But again, that was 2022, so therefore it had been a while since that had been refreshed. So in December, when we kind of undertook this, also with the help of Bob Spatz, we wanted to first start with what's appropriate criteria. And that ended up leading to a conversation we had at the last PLC meeting, you may recall. From there, going back to the drawing board, a methodology was developed and some selection variables. You'll see that on slide 16. One way of fixing variables can be things that are static and things that can change. So I've got Bob Spatz ready to contribute here in a minute if I'm missing anything, but a couple of basics in terms of how these peers were selected. Have to be in Cook or DuPage County, comparable labor market. These districts are also all subject to the tax caps law. We are a unique animal in terms of being a high school only district. There are some other districts that fit that criteria, so we're only comparing ourselves to other high school districts. And those being some fixed variables then leads you to some changing variables. So there's kind of three main drivers. These were selected based on whether they're between 40% and 250% of our student population, our CAV per students, and our poverty level. And so you roll all these things together, and we ended up with a set of 8 peers. You may recall from our meeting last time, we were talking about what's a reasonable number of peers to get to. So that's what you see represented here on slide 16 in kind of a funnel format, starting with the methodology, the selection variables, and the. If Bob has the ability to comment on anything I missed, I will welcome his chance to do that. Did he get in as a panelist? There he is. Okay. So Bob, you're currently on mute. If you have anything you want to add to that, please feel free.
No, just that all the data for this is pulled from the EBF data set that's put out for the EBF calculations. So the enrollment, the EAV, and the DHS poverty levels are all pulled from the EBF data that's publicly available.
Okay, now, the last thing I'll say is, you know, our goal would be to receive feedback, Q&A discussion here. And then be able to come out of this saying that we have the blessing of the CSC to go forward and use these financial peers as we go about our regular business. And making a point then to compare ourselves or reference these peers whenever we want to be able to benchmark or question, well, how are other districts handling a certain issue? So from here, I think it'd be open floor right now if anybody has any thoughts or questions.
So the 8 that are in the output section were the only 8 that were left after applying the changing variables criteria.
That is correct.
And am I reading this correctly, that this would be reviewed, look at this annually to say, applying all these criteria, which are the comparable districts this year?
That's a great point, because we actually discussed that. I think it would make sense to revisit this every year as part of the CSC routine. One related issue, though, is each time the list comes up annually, we may want to decide if we want to resist doing things like throwing districts in and out based on one-year changes. I think we even talked about that at the last meeting.
Yeah, that was gonna be my related question, because I think District 97 Sport Committee that developed something like this back in the day used a 3-year average for each of the metrics to try to smooth out some of that. Just because of 1-year data anomaly, they don't suddenly drop out of the range. So I think you could go either route. You could use a multi-year average, or we could just not necessarily have 1 year automatically drop them out of the.
Okay, question. How different is this list compared to the one that we had before?
What another great question. So I can give you the specific, we were, if I recall correctly, we subtracted 1 and added 2. Bob, do you have that handy? I know I have it here, but
I think I get something where I can pull it up. It looks like Maine 207 and now it's 219 dropped. We added Vermont, but I don't have both things side by side on the screen.
that sounds right.
Okay.
I'm glad you had that handy.
Evanston was an ad also.
Well, they were in, well, I pulled up something in 2003 that has them on it, but I do recall that they were one that was kind of in and out based on their low income percentage.
There's similarities to our school district, means that we had pulled them in for negotiation purposes, but they weren't part of the official set that we had.
And RB was added as well, Riverside Brookfield.
Okay, so I think one issues, we need to decide is, are we taking an average of a 3-year average of the numbers of these peers, and that's our benchmark? Or does once in a district gets to stay there for 3 years?
So I don't know if there's a best practice in terms of how that would normally be done, but it seems like if we're starting somewhat from scratch now, let's start with these 8 and then you just review, so not drop not drop a district after 1 or 2 years, but if they were out of the range in a 3rd year, then drop them. I don't know, but then what about adding same?
Yeah. Because if you keep changing
Yeah, you don't
every
be
year,
changing it all the
then
time,
you have no indicator.
right?
And we're just kind of changing we're trying to keep the curve smooth as opposed to trying to get a definite number of where we are. And comparatively to peers.
One wrinkle to consider on the data side, I think we've got five plus OPRF Cook County districts and 3 DuPage County districts. Cook County reassessing every 3rd year, but DuPage every year. That EAV per pupil calculation is gonna see some potentially big spikes with the Cook districts, but not the DuPage. It's just something to consider, and they would be, I don't know, just off the top of my head, I don't think they wouldn't all be reassessing in Cook County in the same years either. Just based on where they're at geographically.
Bob, do you have an opinion about the tactics for smoothing?
These 8 districts all met it for 3 consecutive years. So that is clean. Typically, I've seen it done one of 2 ways. I think probably what makes the most sense, especially with Steve pointing out about the reassessment, is that once you're in, you would have to miss for 3 years in a row, and once you're out, you would have to meet it for 3 years in a row to be added. I've seen this done with stock portfolios and other things to make sure that it allows transitions, but that any single data point doesn't bring you in and out. And as like I said, as Steve pointed out with the EAV, you would probably want to make sure that it was through another reassessment cycle, that it was either in or that it was out, so that you wouldn't have, a bump at one reassessment, kick it in, but then as things smooth out over the next 2 years, it goes out. So I think that, we can write this into language that potentially gets approved as a procedure, but my recommendation is once you're in, having been in 3 consecutive years, it takes you 3 consecutive years to get kicked out, or 3 consecutive years of a district that hadn't been in to be added. And that also lets you create a list of, if you will, bubble districts, so that, not really a warning list, but just sort of a flashing light on the district saying, oh yeah, it's missed 2 years in a row, may get kicked out soon, or the other way around, this district may be added, so that if you wanted to see what it would look like before and after. And for some 5-year stock graphs that my department used to do, anytime you change the composition for the transition year, you should present all graphs with the original composition and one with the modified composition, just so for transparency point of view, no one can say, oh, well, you took it out and it materially changes, how you look on it. Because companies had a tendency to want to pick and choose their peers for stock performance. And so they say, oh, drop this one out and add this one in. And the SEC caught onto that fairly quickly and said, no, you have to, anytime you have a transition for that 1 year overlap, you have to present the graphs before and after the transition. As again, just as a transparency.
All right, so you're saying, once you're in for at least 3 years.
Yes,
You don't go out of bounds unless you're out of bounds for 3 years, basically.
right.
And thank you for reminding me, because this set of 8 that's identified here already meets a 3-year rolling criteria of being within our peer group.
Yes, yes. And any procedure should obviously have, something for, an outlier circumstance. If a high school district merged with its elementary districts, we would kick it out for that reason, or, something else extraordinary. But just for drifting over the line, you wouldn't be kicked out in a year. But, again, if you merge with your elementary districts, that fundamentally changes what your numbers look like. And you'd have to be kicked out sooner.
Nothing really changes though. This is like school. It's not like stocks where, oh.
Thank you.
Nothing really changes though. I mean, it's not like stocks or eggs or anything. Like, we're gonna be pretty steady. I mean, next year in 2 years, we may not have any money because we're spending on construction. So are we gonna kick ourselves out and go and deal with schools that don't have money? Not really. We're just gonna have a little asterisk on the side of the chart, like he said, this is where we are right now. We project to be back here. And if LT has an issue, maybe we put an asterisk right there. I think once we get the concrete similarities that we want to go with, I think we should be fine with there. We should make allotments every year of why there might be a difference or something like that. But this is, LaGrange isn't going to all of a sudden drop property values by 30% and not have people pay taxes. And neither is Lamont, definitely not Riverside. So, I mean, we picked these. So I think you guys picked these. So kind of understand that they're going to be here and there's going to be adjustment. We just have to make sure that we document the adjustment as to why. So, I mean,
I think you're right.
I think the 3 years is a good thing, but really it should be like 6 or something, because nothing really changes in school. People are always trying to make things better. And,
Right. And I think it's important to note that, it's in the slide, but that all of these are input decisions that school boards don't have any control over. It's not about the rate at which you tax. It's not about the rate of state funding. It's not about, how much you're spending per pupil, what your teacher contract is, anything that the school board could have any control of. It's enrollment, again, which if you merge with another district would radically change it. Your EAB, which again fluctuates, but usually is pretty correlated regionally, and your poverty, percent of poverty, which again doesn't change rapidly in our area. So I would expect that that these districts should fit the criteria for 6-8 years in a row. Again, obviously something that's just right at the border, could drift out a year or two. Is already commented on. Evanston is like at 220% of our poverty level. Could it drift over 250? Sure, but it's not very likely to happen anytime soon, and certainly not quickly.
Okay.
and with that, you give yourself a range of 40 to 250%. So that's a deep, reasonable size range.
Yeah, it's interesting that, part of the reason you have to create that degree of breadth is just because you want to have enough peer districts to have a useful sample to compare to. Okay, so any other comments regarding?
I think we just need to summarize. Whether we look at it every year. That is the answer. The 3-year average, it sounds like most are in agreement with this, at least 3-year average, if they fall for 3 years or the 3-year average comes into place. So I think it sounds like we're all in agreement on that one. Review the year. That could be something as simple as, just run the metrics every year and see if there's someone that's, well, is out for this, or has missed the mark for this year, and see if there's someone that's made the mark, and just review that in this sort of way. That could be a review every year happening. So that we, because then, 1 year out and then 2 years out from now, we'll see, each year we'll see if there's someone that was, I'll say on the bubble, because we're gonna already plan this. We can see year over year if there's someone right there, they're coming in. Then we know 3 years out. I can't say every 3 years we're gonna be like making changes per se, but just that we do it every year in a sense that we just run the criteria real quick. And just watch the averages of those ones that may have come in or out.
Yeah, we're setting a routine for the CSC to monitor. Each year we rerun the numbers, see what pops. Chances are not a lot's gonna be popping, but at least we have a routine that we're always checking in on these.
So that one sounds like everybody to there. Okay.
Where do we get the metrics from? We're gonna get out the report card.
Bob, I think the source data is the EDF model, right?
Okay.
Right, the EBF full calculation model. A procedure should probably be developed that has documents where it can be found on the state website and exactly which columns from which worksheets of the, very complicated spreadsheet it's being pulled from. But all that is from the EBF full calculation model spreadsheet.
So who takes care of that every year? Is it the CFC? Is it us?
The EDF model.
No, of the, the review.
Well, actually,
Maybe the-
we were looking at the EDF model, last point, I think the EDF model, the current one.
No, I think what she's asking is who does what Graham just said.
The once a year review to to see if any one of these have
Oh,
gone out.
Yeah, is that?
Is that
I think it's Greg Coe. I
Yeah.
think that's.
Oh,
yeah, Tony or Brian would run the metrics for the districts. They could say they have access to the information that we don't have, they have like a system, or even Steve has access to the system, right?
Well, the EBF is just a spreadsheet on his website.
okay.
But they would pull that.
Metro wants to do it.
I would
It's
love to
right
know
on the
that.
annual-
I'll volunteer. That sounds very interesting to me.
Someone will pull the information.
But someone needs to tell me what to look for and then I can.
Right, it's like, right.
Raise your hand and get
You
started.
can do it for us.
It's a good question. And one that might get revisited when we get to topics for future meetings.
So it's, but two people, but to be determined who pulls the information, how about that? But so yeah, let's be your own monitor and look at it. 3-year average, keep it in mind. Anything else related to that? We have to do anything with the board, like anything like recommendations to the board or anything?
Well, so, Tom, who sends us regrets, couldn't be here tonight, but, we have to do a report out to the board. And, I'll write a statement of bullets that we're gonna tell the board and let you see that, make sure that we're on the same page. And it's basically gonna be that, CSC reviewed this, they've given us guidance on how we should revisit it. And we have CSC's blessing or endorsement, or however we might phrase it, to the board. The board is hungry for your approval, and so they're gonna be thrilled to find out that you're supportive of this.
Anything else on that, anybody?
Okay, so this agenda topic is Roman numeral 4, item A, Adam, and it's called Peer Districts / Financial Dashboard.
Oh, breakfast, thank you for that.
So I'm gonna talk just very briefly because it gets even more exciting. So imagine that we have established this rock solid data and evidence-based set of peers. Now we get to do things like decide what are the important measurements for us that we want to compare ourselves to those peers. So this is a little bit early. It was not quite ready for prime time, but I'll hand this around so people can look at it. Working with Tony and his team, we took a couple of preliminary runs of benchmarking our data against that of our new peers. And kind of just the most fundamental bedrock starting point would be something like per pupil operating expenditures, per pupil salary and benefit expenses, and then also our rate of expense growth per pupil on a 5-year year-over-year average. So I'm gonna hand these out. You can take a look at them. I'm sorry I don't have copies for everybody. This is a bit of a last minute together because we're still fine tuning some of the language on how we describe this data. And then also we're double checking the math to make sure we have it. Is that possible?
We do have copy machines here.
I got a break.
We sure this. Thank you.
If you'd like to, I could have Brian pull up and project the screen.
Oh, look at that. That's a great idea also.
Hey, Brian, can you pull up the PowerPoint that I had sent over?
Yep, doing that right now.
So these are starter ingredients to the dashboard we've talked a lot about. And you know, where do we sit compared to our peers on, in this case, per pupil operating expenses. Then the next one is specifically salaries and benefits per pupil. Now this is very nice how Tony and his team did this because they broke up salaries and benefits. You know, healthcare being such a big factor these days in employee compensation. And then the next one is super interesting. What is the growth rate of our expenses expressed on our per pupil basis? You know, these are basic guardrails to help guide you because, you know, we can't afford to, you know, be at one extreme end of compensation, but we also don't want to be the lowest provider of compensation because we're competing for talented individuals to come and teach our kids. This last one here, this is one where we're kind of confirming some of the math and the calculations, and that's the reason this is not yet ready to be emailed out. But you may recall, I think it was 2 meetings ago when this topic came up, and Steve had provided probably a dozen potential metrics for us to think about using. So these are the starting 3. This is the 3 we're going to start with. I think one thing that CFC could do is, you know, every time we meet, we're going to look at our metrics. I think CFC could, each time we meet, say, all right, it's time to add this metric, you know, adding 1 or 2 more as we go along and get into a habit of referencing this kind of data and using it and so forth. I think that's something we should do as a group.
That's a really enlightening one.
It sure is.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't have expected that. Yeah, that looks really good and one that we should be very proud of.
Yeah, and you know, Bob, Steve, and I have a long multi-year history of you know, working with this kind of information. And I think it's a best practice for a district to do. So, you know, this is not something that, you know, we're gonna come and talk about today and then sort of forget about. We want this to be part of a standard operating rhythm for both the Board of Education itself and then this committee.
We'll say when I saw some of these earlier in the discussion back before the emails, he does like this one, the salary and benefits. I really like that you guys decided to break that out because you're, like you said, healthcare is so different. Like each contract can be different. But it's like if you separate it out, you can really see. You can get more of like a granular detail data of the comparison.
Yeah, and again, I give Tony credit for that, he just went and did that without even processing.
The only thing I've got to do is when I'm seeing it on the screen now is change our colors. It is a little bit tough with the blue and the orange, but I'll pick some different colors, so we are easier to pick out than having to find our name and line us up, but thank you.
Hey, you can put the orange and blue though.
So again, these are works in process. Certainly, if people wanna share thoughts or opinions, we'd love to hear it, but these are still being worked on.
Is the timeline for rolling this out to the website still this summer or fall? Maybe,
The target timeline is this spring.
spring,
We-
okay.
Yeah, I mean, I wish we were maybe a month ahead of where we were, and I'll take the hit for that, but no, we wanna get this going as quickly as we can, and coming here and getting your blessing on the peer districts was one of the important steps. And now we just need to fine tune some of the language and double check the math, and then these 3 starter metrics will be ready to start posting on our website.
From anybody at a high level, was there some metric that you guys were like. Really jonesing for that Graham and then. Get out there from the get-go? You can think of. Cause you have the intimate knowledge of. the
Right,
different
well, I remember
metrics.
the other things in the 12 that we looked at a couple meetings. Yeah, I guess sort of the next in line stuff for me would be on the revenue side, kind of looking at the split of state. Local funding, property taxes, comparisons, that sort of stuff, that I think would be interesting for the community to see.
Yeah, I think we had talked about pie charts, right? One that had the revenue sources and one that had the big expenditure buckets, just to help people visualize where the money comes from and where it goes. It seems like those would be pretty easy to add. Also, just going back to the peer districts for the kind of data geeks among us. It would be nice if it was clickable through to like a spreadsheet that had the metrics for at least the peer districts. So that like the EAD per student for each of the peers and the enrollment and the poverty rate. So that people could see those as well.
So click through to a spreadsheet with the source data.
Yeah, not for all the 33 districts or all the, 250 or whatever, but just for the 8 that have been selected. Just the variables, I think it would be good to include those values in case anybody wants to see them.
Yeah, I do have a question.
Just very quick, Graham mentioned that this is preliminary data. It's also important to note this is from the AFRs from fiscal year 2023. It's my understanding that 2024 will be available, so there may be not just double checking the calculations going on, but there'll be new year fiscal data available before these would be finalized, I expect as well. Certainly before the next CFC meeting.
Okay, maybe that's a footnote we wanna include then.
I think it might be also useful to clarify. Thank you, Lisa. I should know better than that. I think it might be also useful to clarify that the number of peer districts we settle on, in 3 years, that's immaterial, correct? I mean, you did this to get to a manageable number in some ways. You described kind of working with the, 250 to get something that was useful, but if down the road you reapply this and suddenly we have 10. That's totally fine, right? There's no magic number.
I think that's true. That's part of our conversation last time. I think I even have in my notes, 8 to 12 is sort of an ideal number.
Just because that's easy to look at visually. 2 or 3 wouldn't be enough and 50 would be it's hard to get anything useful out of it.
So we don't wanna get too wedded. Okay, good.
In theory, that brief explanation could also be on the landing page.
That's what I was thinking.
For the, yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Make it transparent.
yeah, this is how this list comes together and all that, so, maybe like 2 paragraphs or something. So,
And I think that also potentially goes into the procedure for annual review, that if somehow, you know, again, I think this stuff is likely to be very, very stable in Cook and DuPage County because they're both long built up areas, that if the number of districts drifts out of the 8 to 12 range, then the CFC should reevaluate the criteria or something along that line, just to indicate that, again, 8 isn't a magical number, it's what happened out with these criteria. Yeah, so that I think is worth putting in there too, is just being transparent that we were shooting for between 8 and 12, and if, you know, numbers somehow change, that, you know, you may have to either change the criteria or change or very consciously decide that 8 to 12 isn't the best number to stick with long term. But again, I think it should be very stable, but it's good in procedure to document what happens. If you fail to meet one criteria, you shouldn't just automatically assume that you should accept that result.
Are there gonna be like, you know, like targets of where we wanna come in as a, you know, school district? Like X, you know, away from the need, the median, or, I mean, is that? Are there gonna be KPIs that we measure against? We wanted to be here, but we ended up here. So our action plan to get to where we wanna be. Is that also could be part of the process?
Probably not, at least right now as this is conceived, this is conceived at the moment of just understanding where we stand. And I think, I guess I would have to defer to a full Board of Education opinion about, you know, what if we were at one extreme or the other, what do we think about that? Chances are, if we were at the very bottom, we'd probably say, hey, are we under investing? Or, you know, are we providing enough compensation, for example, to make sure we attract the best and brightest and so forth? I think I'd be too out on a limb if I were to say, you know, and I think we need to be X. But I think that's also something where this group can make its own determination and opinions and call out things. I think the board is going to be looking in the future more for the CFC to be a little more roll up sleeves and be a little more involved in guidance and so forth. So I wasn't being facetious when I said, you know, our BOE really wants probably more input. So your views of where we sit on these metrics, in addition to which metrics we should be using, I think we're going to be super interested in hearing.
I won't speak for Tom, but I remember him talking about, because Tom always asks about where we at compared to our peers. I think when Tom's doing that, it's like if we're like all of a sudden in every single category at the top, he wants us to like analyze and be like, why? Like I know for like special education, we're at the top, but there's a reason for that because the board direction is we spend on that, it's in-house, all that stuff. So there's reasons behind that. So I think that's more of us probably with metrics asking the questions each year sometimes when we're looking at it, be like, oh, why are you so high or why are you so low? Then explanation, then pass on to the board, and then the board can take that information for the decision, make it what they need to do is where I'm saying, because it's all ultimately up to, he's only one voice of 7 to make a decision whether they want to do something or not do something. Then obviously Greg and Vince have some, like why we're here. So.
Are these correctly labeled as the medians salary and benefits and the median operating expenses for people are, mean?
The labeling of this is part of what's a WIP, so I would say ignore that, it's gonna be changed.
The intention though to use well, I guess this is just a reference point, but it seems like the mean would make more sense than median to me in this case.
That's up for debate, I think, you know. Bob and I and Tony, we were sort of kicking that around, so. Your vote is for the mean.
Because it's already a select group, right? I mean, you use the median to throw out the outliers, but there shouldn't really be any outliers in here because this is already a pretty curated group of peers. So to me, it's I would advocate for the mean.
I would agree with that.
Yeah, Cal or Steve, I remember my meeting, that's why I was wondering. I could break that down for best.
Bob, what was the reason we were using the median?
Just, again, for the outlier issue, without seeing the data, with the small number, one outlier can switch the mean. Best practice probably is to list median and mean. And, that can provide some information in and of itself. For this particular set of things, it does look like mean probably provides more information, but as you get to 5, 10, 20 slides, the distribution may be different and that there may be one or two outliers either direction, such that the median is more important. But I agree with this particular set of 3 slides, the mean is probably more useful than the median, as well as the way it's visually presented. And with 9, the median is also very easy to pull out from the chart in a way that with a larger number, median is hard to spot. It's the 5th out of 9. So,
When we did this for V97, we actually did use the mean. So this is good feedback, we can switch that up.
Okay, Steve and Cal.
I knew Bob would have a better rationale than me, but I agree with everybody's statement.
So do I.
Which is why we're bringing these before we go live. Figure them out. And Graham's like way more work. Comments on the dashboard.
When will 24 data be available? 2024.
This was done as of the end of last week, but then in conversations, it sounds like 24 data actually just went live, so
Okay.
I will have you heard that tonight, go back tomorrow, make sure that for our peer group, everybody's locked and loaded, and then it's pretty easy to update from there.
I think it'll be better because we'll have more like post-COVID
Yeah.
data as opposed to in the middle of COVID data.
Behind us here, that would be nice, and just accepted their audit, or is accepting their audit next meeting, which is like, the audit's usually done in November back in the day, so. The data is behind and getting out. Next up is item 4B, the funding procedures for capital projects.
Sure. And again, this I'll intro it and then kick it over to Graham to lead us in conversation. We started to talk about as we look forward, we have our 10-year capital improvement plan and other bigger capital projects that come down the road, starting to outline our CFC's take on best practices of funding different capital projects. And what I've done, these were the handouts that you are into, the printed ones. Just took a slide from a DAP 101 presentation from IASPO, that's the Illinois Association of School Business Officials. Just outlines kind of all the different types of funding that is available if a district is to go out to debt for a capital project, what the repayment terms are, do they require a referendum or a public hearing? Are they subject to the debt limit? And it really outlines what gets paid for through the debt service extension base versus operating funds in the district. More just a reference point for this conversation. And then the second page just shows our debt service extension base right now has zero debt against it. Our debt certificates are paid for through our operating funds. So those would not fall on here. And this is just pulled from update from Liz Hennessy with some of the documents she had sent over recently. So with that, Graham, I'll go ahead and kind of kick it to you to just talk through kind of the charge of what we're looking for and go from there.
Okay, so maybe this is one we try to cap this conversation maybe at 10 minutes, only because I realize this could potentially go on forever, but big picture, what we'd like CFC to help advise on is philosophically, what are our best practices, or what do we want to say are going to be our guidelines going forward in the funding of major capital projects. So I'm not necessarily talking about the regular summer work that comes up every year where you got to take care of accessibility and life safety and functionality, things like that. But rather significant capital projects, whether it's P 3, 4, 5 or something else. What would we want to say our rules of the road are in terms of how they should be funded? And if that involves debt, what are some boundary conditions or guidelines for the use of debt? This, in some ways, it kind of ties out to the dashboard discussion, because one of the metrics that Bob and I did for 97 also was long-term per pupil debt, and we actually compared ourselves to peer districts as well. So that's kind of the issue statement that we're looking for feedback on. I can tell you, I'll share one, perspective. Operating funds for operating expenses, and then for capital projects, long-term debt makes a lot of sense because, you're spreading that capital cost out over a long period of time and out over, in some cases, several generations of students who might make use of those facilities. Is that an appropriate starting point? If we want to say that long-term debt is how we want to fund that, is there a certain boundary condition we want to say about how much CapEx debt is appropriate, either expressed on a per pupil basis or as a percentage of our tax levy? There's a lot of different ways to set those parameters. And we're kind of, early in this conversation, but what we don't want to do is have a situation where every time a major project gets proposed or considered, we are inventing from whole cloth our principles, our approaches, our guidelines for how we want to fund that kind of stuff, because the district inevitably is always going to have a continuous need to be refreshing its infrastructure, whether you're one school district like us, or you have multiple campuses. So we need some ideas, we need some debate, you know. This is not an easy nut to crack, but the board doesn't want to be flying, you know, solo without CFC input or without some principles and guidelines that we can lay down. That will hopefully have a lasting place for not just our board, but future boards as they always continue CapEx projects.
I will say, I had a couple of years ago, we looked at debt policy sorts, and we kind of compared it to other debt policies, and we realized that debt policies are very broad.
You're right, they
don't
tend to
push, they're
just
not very-
discuss all the different ways you can
Yeah.
issue debt and.
We determined that we didn't, we were like, is that going too far, like putting like very strict boundaries in the debt policy that. I don't know, this remember.
That was kind of my question, I guess, is the board looking less for a policy and more for a recommended rates? I guess you use the word principles, right? We're not looking to codify anything as official as the school board policy.
Correct. I mean, let's just start with some best practices, some basic principles. Later on, if there was a reason to codify into formal policy, we could visit that eventually.
Or call some of the things which we've talked about multiple times before, so like the DCEP here, that he printed out. I think we were like framework and stuff like that was do not issue DCEP or add the payback more than 4 or 5 years, right? So I feel like it's like 3 to 5 was the range.
So maybe it's a little longer than that, but it was definitely.
It was definitely not like
You wouldn't-
do not use it for 10 to 20 years.
Yeah, you wouldn't
The payback.
handcuff future boards by utilizing all of that.
Right, so if we didn't go over 10, it was like 5%.
Yeah, and I feel like we had kind of an either or of the time and amount available or something like that.
And I think we talked about how many students a project would affect. So like a gym floor, everybody's gonna use it, so it's kind of like a project that we would finance for a longer time versus, you know, a row of lockers or something, or a section of lockers that only freshmen would use or something. I think we talked about how many students are gonna actually use it. So then that's when the whole per student investment came into play, but we didn't really go any farther than that. And just left it there. But it's a reasonable theory. Because the more students that are affected by something, the more positive of the project it is.
Side, I don't recall if we. I guess maybe I'm just gonna speak my preferences, is that again, not wanting to handcuff future boards, that we wouldn't wanna commit. You know, X% or X $1 million out of operating that, you know, beyond a certain amount, that's something like that, where there's gotta be some kind of scale. On that side too. I know we had lots of conversations about, is there a dollar threshold that should trigger referendum conversations versus non-referendum options as well? What we didn't land on, a threshold like that is.
That was the hard part, that's very political, we're supposed to be just the numbers guys.
I've been to those ISBO conferences before, like many a time, and they always have someone from Wilmette or Winnetka always speaking, and they say referendum like it's sliced bread. That's all they say, and it's like no one up there reads their tax bill or anything. So yeah, we're just gonna do a referendum and everything will be fine. They say it, it's like the strangest thing. It's like I never ever said referendum in my life, and I went to this thing and we sat there, it's like 8 to 12 or something. In the morning, and literally every 3 minutes, someone's saying referendum.
Okay, so, but, you know, before we even get to that question, you know, referendum for what? maybe we start with a hypothesis. Is the best way to fund major capital improvement projects, long-term debt? Capital bonds, is the consensus yes or no? If it's yes, how much debt is too much debt? How far into the future, do we wanna see bonds go? If we accept the premise, what are the, boundary conditions or principles, that a district should follow from a best practices standpoint?
So let's start with the first question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, how else would you fund it? We don't wanna have a fund balance available to fund major capital projects anymore. That's part of the fund balance policy. So therefore, you would have to use debt to fund major projects.
I agree.
All right, yeah, and I'm sorry to speak so elementally, because you're right, it's completely anomalous that you would even have a fund balance this, okay. So assume that, you're not in an anomalous circumstance. So if we accept that basic principle, what are some of the rules of the road and parameters that make sense for the use of long-term capital bonds?
It has to affect at least 80% of the student body. I think didn't it still be like 180 million some years ago to redo internet and things like that in the 2 high schools? Something crazy like that, but then the way they sold it was, we're updating our infrastructure, we're gonna have all the electrical, all the wiring, everything's gonna be fine, we're gonna have internet for the next 50 years or 30 years or something. And all the students will be able to use. So you have to give it a percentage of how many students are gonna be affected by it. Which is why it's taking us so long to do a pool, because everyone just said pool forever. And it was 86 kids swimming. And that's what the other 10,000 people said. There's only 86 kids swimming, but then you kind of put it into a bigger structure and an aquatic center, gym, and all that other stuff. Now everyone's gonna use it, and now you're getting it done.
Graham, that's the metric is dollar amount type of project. I think that's where we struggle a lot with trying to come to consensus on that percent. Calories throw out a percentage of it
80%.
automatically bonded out if it's 80% more than.
Students, they're all gonna use it. It's like a gym floor. Everyone's gonna use it for gym. I mean, the floor is not just for basketball, it's for everybody. It's all
Yeah. It's a project that only affects 30% of the students, and it's like $20 million. Only 30% of the students are affected, so they just throw that project out and say it's not allowed.
No, but you can figure out a different way to finance it or something like that, or try to bundle it with something.
Steve, have you ever landed on any kind of a metric that is percent of a tax levy that is used for debt? Is there a typical or representative?
Not on the percentage basis, well, no, to be honest, part of the problem is because the tax base is so variable from one community and district to another, that varies a lot. So one of your other questions, the outset about how much and things like that, there are state statutes that provide some guardrails on how much districts can borrow in total, how much they can borrow different types of bonds, like cash bonds, and how much you can levy in a given year for DSEP. So I think those all, create a good framework for how much. I don't know if we need to invent something new on top of that. But I think it is important to try to translate some of that into a tax rate. In fact, that would be an interesting analysis to do with pure districts. Because I don't know what that would look like.
And then definitely rentals, things, it's like, unless you know you're talking, unless I know me and you would agree, I'm like, okay, yeah. Because we've been dealing with stuff, right, we know exactly what you're talking about. And EAV, 6.9% the max debt rate, all that stuff, it's something no one ever thinks about, like, we can see that. And translating that into what the school districts especially since it's interesting to follow like our max debt we can issue over the like last 10 years has gone like it's exponentially because the EAV has gone up nicely. The amount of debt limit we're allowed is increased exponentially too. You know, like back in the day, it used to be like 120 million, now it's a lot higher.
Well, and the DSEP now growing by CPI, I think that's might be close to double what it was when the original DSEP was set, because of that CPI growth. You can see how much it grows going forward based on the sizes.
Okay, what about long-term debt per student? Is there a best practice you're familiar with or a typical or representative of that?
No, but that would be a very interesting analysis to do. Yeah, a little tricky. You have to see how day by day gets reported to ISB because bonds versus the operating debt, I'm not sure if you just look at the bonded debt information, it's the reporting will pick. It might show that Oakcraft has zero debt when you have, you know, the debt certificates outstanding, so we have to check on that to see if we can really get good data there.
You're right, but Bob made that same point, there's gonna be multiple forms of that debt. As you may recall, we produce that metric also compared to peer districts. And to me, that's probably gonna be dashboard metric number 4 is long-term debt per pupil. Okay, so without belaboring this too much, I think you know, I don't expect magical answers right now this evening, but maybe as you think of things, please shoot me an email. Because, you know, what we don't want to do, you think about, you know, everything that led up to project 2. We were coming out of kind of these anomalous conditions where you hadn't invested in the building since 1967 at all. An oversized fund balance developed. There was zero use of debt over those 50 years. Is that a good idea for a school district to not be making use of debt for capital projects for 50+ years? I think what I'm hearing this committee say is no, it's not a good approach. Okay. So if we go forward with the philosophy that, yeah, we want to use long-term debt to fund major capital projects. Establishing the rules of the road of that or parameters and so forth, other than potentially comparing our long-term student debt versus peer districts, I'm not hearing a lot of other specific guideposts. That's what I'm getting out of this. But if you, you know, have a light bulb go off within the next couple of days, I think me and Tom would really want to hear your thoughts.
I think a peer district comparison as a starting point would be helpful to understand how similar districts have approached the use of debt. Including debt that's in the operating budget or debt that's revenue of debt.
Okay, that's great guidance. There's the number, and then there's also their approaches. And Tony, I really appreciate you coming to the table here with a visual. Because this is very helpful as well.
This is the first time I've ever seen anything like this. Should go to ISBO, I get an invite next year. I think, yeah, we could go like Grant said, yeah, kind of a short 10 minutes as we go on. I think it's one of those. Think about it. We'll bring it back at a future meeting probably. When we have more. We'll put more time into the meeting to discuss it. And if we have points ahead of time, we can research them. Like, check them out, like, Kathleen said, we can probably use pull some data on. Like, I'll go look at some audits we have school districts that are our peer districts and see what kind of debt they have, where it's lost debt, or like if they got working capital, what's that? Normal bond, and kind of like layer that in and see where that's all at. And gather that information to help us see where other people are at, what they're doing. Or I'll just make a idea like what they're doing over and over again. That work for everybody? No.
Yes, but at the same time, I want us to realize that we could just be at the top of the food chain and be really smart people. Because we've saved money, we're in this position now, we're improving the school, and we have a little bit of debt, so. Well, we have debt, not a little bit, but, I mean, I don't. Everyone might be different than us, and I don't want us to have to say, okay, we wanna be more like them. If we're like at the top of the food chain, let's just run with it. And you speak at ISBO next year, and we're just, it.
We're getting stuff
I-
done.
Let's not be shocked if that's our result, that's what I'm saying.
Well, and the hard part of doing these comparisons too is you don't know what other districts' physical plan looks like and where they're at. They could be where Oak Europe was, 5 or 10 years ago with decades of deferred things, or they could have just done $100 million worth of work and everybody's gonna be a little bit spot.
But hearing just a lot of what would help drive this conversation for the next meeting, at least it's giving me some initial, I wonder if this is available, I wonder if that's available, so, I'll come back to you with the next meeting, trying to find as much of this or relevant information that can tie to this as possible.
That works. So item 4C says tax bill reviews. This is basically, Kathleen, this is your pension question that you forwarded to me to pass on for this meeting. So it's because you were getting a lot of questions and probably some detail about it. So was that Brian or you?
Brian's actually gonna take us through what he has put together here, and Brian, I'll go ahead and pass it over to you.
All right, thanks, Tony. And this might, the questions I know kind of funneled through Greg and Kathleen. So this presentation may go a little bit outside the boundaries of what you were first looking for. But I did kind of want to tie in a couple different areas that sort of fit within this whole conversation as to where those numbers on the tax bill come from and that type of thing. So let me just make sure I have my screen shared here. Okay. So, on the most recent set of property tax bills, some of you may have noticed there's a section on there that contains debt and financial data, both for District 200 and other taxing districts in the area. Where I kind of was going with this presentation is I wanted to explain, where that information on the tax bill comes from, why it's on there, and what it really means in regards to the district's finances. And, if some of what I touch on in these slides doesn't address, questions you all have received from community members, then we can obviously, discuss those in more detail. Just for historical context, though, to begin with, the origin of this information on the tax bills goes back to a debt disclosure ordinance that was approved by the Cook County Board of Commissioners back in 2009. The ordinance requires taxing districts within the county to file an annual disclosure that includes our most recent audit report and then other information pertaining to the district's debt and pension plans. The ultimate goal of that ordinance was to provide additional transparency so taxpayers could understand what their local governments, which local governments are receiving taxes from them, and then how much debt those governments have outstanding. The full set of information that gets collected from the debt disclosure filings gets published in the property tax portal on the Cook County Treasurer's website. So there's a link here if you're interested in going and looking at specific taxing bodies. A summarized version began appearing on first installment property tax bills back in 2016. So this slide here contains a screenshot of a sample Oak Park residence tax bill. And you can see on the left-hand side, there's a list of all the entities that receive taxes from this particular property, along with columns going across the top for money owed, pension and healthcare amounts promised, amount of pension and healthcare shortage, and the percentage of pension and healthcare costs that each taxing district can pay. So the next couple slides are just going to explain the meaning of these various columns in a little bit more detail. Now, one thing worth noting is that the word debt has a very literal meaning in relation to this particular ordinance. We often think of debt as things like we've been having in our previous conversations, where it's an interest-bearing, bank obligation. But in this case, money owed by the taxing district actually refers to all liabilities within the district's audit, with the exception of pensions. A breakdown of those liabilities for our district is shown in the pie chart here. Some of the liabilities, such as accounts payable and accrued payroll, are essentially timing differences where the district is paying vendors or employees after year end for goods received or work performed prior to year end. However, the largest category, labeled other post-employment benefits or OPEB liabilities, represents future insurance benefits that will be owed on behalf of employees after they retire. So that leads us into some of the more technical debt disclosure information. It's often, a lot of these phrases often get defined using accounting terminology. So I'll do my best to kind of explain it in more common language here. So the second column of data on the tax bill, the one that was called pension and healthcare amounts promised, that is a liability that measures the amount of money the district would need to set aside today to pay for all expected future retirement benefits when they come due. So as you might guess, that value is estimated by an actuary using a wide variety of assumptions. Column 3, which is called amount of pension and healthcare shortage, takes the actuarial liability I just mentioned and subtracts any plan assets or money that's been set aside for the specific purpose of funding those future benefits. If the assets do not meet or exceed the liability, there's considered to be a shortage of funding. Then the final column, which is labeled percentage of pension and healthcare costs the taxing district can pay, that is the portion of the liability that could be covered using plan assets if the full liability came due today. So in other words, the phrase that typically gets used to describe that is the funding ratio of the plan. One final note in regards to the debt disclosure information is that Cook County actually excludes TRS from the pension liabilities that get reported. So all of the amounts I just described, when you see that on the tax bill, it's only taking into account the IMRF pension plan and the district's OPEB. This next slide outlines some of the differences between how pension plans and OPEB obligations are funded by OPRF specifically. Pension contributions are made to TRS and IMRF, and those are based on a percentage of employee salaries. The specific percentages get assigned to OPRF by each pension plan, and we pay 100% of our assigned contributions as part of our normal payroll process.
Brian, can I just ask you a clarifying question?
Sure.
So the TRS is the teacher's pension fund, and then the IMRF is the other non-teacher pension fund, is that correct?
Yes, IMRF is for non-certified employees.
Okay, thank you.
So although, the pension plans account for they're separate entities and they account for their own plan assets and liabilities, any unfunded pension liability actually gets allocated to each of the participating employers and then reported on our financial statements. Where OPEB is different is that their contributions are more within the district's control. And what I mean by that is those benefits that are occurring post-employment are typically bargained, through the collective bargaining agreement. So in our case, we have the district will pay a share of retiree insurance premiums. Those are considered OPEB. Again, OPRF pays 100% of these benefits as they become due, but the difference is there's no plan assets maintained when it comes to our OPEB. So the entire OPEB liability gets treated as an unfunded liability. Now that pay-as-you-go type strategy is very common for school districts when it comes to OPEB, but it's also the biggest reason for why you would see a pension and healthcare shortage amount reported on our district's debt disclosure.
And then
So-
just another clarifying question.
Mm-hmm.
So then the total contribution to the teacher pension fund, the TRS, is $226,854. That's the total contribution from OPRF.
Yes, that is the district's responsibility for contributions to TRS.
Okay, thank you. And same with the benefits, so that total is just 439,000, that's 100% of what OPRF pays.
Right.
Thank you.
All right, so this table outlines some of the key differences then between the TRS and IMRF pension plans. The most notable difference is that the state of Illinois is involved in the funding of the TRS pension plan, whereas IMRF is funded solely by its participating members and employers. As you can see in the footnote at the bottom of the slide, OPRF's contribution rate to IMRF in recent years has ranged anywhere from 6 to 10% of salaries. Meanwhile, all TRS employers contribute the same 0.58% of salaries, while the state is then expected to cover the remainder. For several decades now, the state has routinely contributed less than the amount recommended by TRS plan actuaries, which has resulted in a plan funding ratio for TRS of only 45%. IMRF, on the other hand, has a funding ratio above 95% as of its last measurement date. So just to put those numbers into a little bit of perspective, the U.S. Government Accountability Office has opined that a public pension system should have a funding ratio of at least 80% in order to be considered financially healthy. So you can see why the funding status of the TRS pension plan garners so much public attention. So what impacts could unfunded pension liabilities have on our district's finances? With IMRF, an unfunded liability increases the likelihood of the district being assigned a higher contribution rate. That rate, as I mentioned earlier, changes annually each calendar year. So this rate is also a key assumption within the district's financial projections. The IMRF rate typically has an inverse relationship with the assumption for investment earnings. And that's because when interest rates are higher, the plan's investments perform better, and then fewer contributions are needed from employers to keep the plan adequately funded. The opposite is also true, so that when interest rates are lower, and we're currently projecting interest rates to fall in the near future, our assumption would then be that our district IMRF contribution rate will gradually increase over the next couple of years. If we talk about this in terms of dollars, a 1% increase in our employer rate equals about $156,000 of additional expenses. So it would take a rate increase of several percentage points above our assumption in order to have a significant impact on the district's finances. TRS is a little bit more of a wild card. The need for pension reform has been discussed for quite some time, but changes to the plan's funding structure would require legislation. There's been several previous attempts at reform, but they have stalled, mostly because of fears that the proposed changes could be determined unconstitutional by the courts, or, also lead to massive property tax hikes or classroom cuts at a local level. An example of this is shown at the bottom of the slide. So if the TRS employer contribution rate was increased from its current rate of 0.58%, you can see what the impact would be to our district in terms of dollars. Some districts would have a very difficult time accommodating a jump of more than a couple percentage points within their budgets. However, it would also take much more than a few percentage points to begin putting a noticeable dent into that TRS unfunded liability without having additional measures of reform tied in. So while a pension shift could potentially happen at some point, it wouldn't be something that would happen overnight. And for that reason, we have not incorporated it as an assumption within our financial projections, so that we are, presenting the most realistic scenario, to the board, to the district, to the community, whenever we present a financial projection, just based on the information that's currently available to us. Now, with that said, Tony and I are always monitoring any pension-related conversations in Springfield. So if those were to pick up steam again, we would be aware of those and prepared to modify our projection assumptions if necessary, and certainly revisit those with the CFC. So that's, the information that I prepared. If there's additional questions committee members have, I'm happy to take those.
Does that
Yeah, thank you, Brian and Tony, that's very helpful in clarifying. I think the main question that I've been trying to process is what's on this last slide here, which is how could the unfunded liability affect OPRF, and is it something that that the district needs to be thinking about and planning for? So it's good to hear that you are thinking about that, and will be planning for it as needed.
I just have to say, Brian, this was very kudos to you guys for the presentation. That was very helpful. Especially that slide about the tax bill. I could never tie those out. Now I realize it's because the TRS is not on there.
Yeah.
Because I was constantly trying to, why is this not tied out? I did not realize it's because TRS is not on there. So that's very helpful. But I
take zero, the kudos here, this is all right.
Right.
And I did not, just for the record, I did not come across a reason as to why TRS is not included in that. The only thing I could think of is that, with the number of different types of taxing bodies on there, obviously school districts are the only ones that are going to be contributing to TRS. And because that funding situation is in such a poor condition, it would kind of pull down, the numbers and percentages for a school district relative to municipalities, libraries, counties, and that type of thing. But that's, conjecture on my part.
I think just because the state's on the hook for it at this point, if there was a cost shift, the district was obligated part of it.
Yeah, probably. So I think they also like showing long-term debt. They have like some metrics on the good, I guess, portal with long-term debt. That local government as well. You're on the hook for sometimes, as they say. All right. So thanks for that. I thought those were helpful. So I'm gonna ask a question. I'm just gonna give this PowerPoint presentation. It's your email. I got something. Yeah. Here we go. Or get Brian's number out. All right. Item 4D, the updated EBF calculations.
Sure. This, we bring it, to the board on an annual basis, and then it just comes, to CFC for information. One thing is we prepared this in conversations with the board, that we've added that will look a little bit new is, we added the percentage of adequacy of our expenditures. Knowing that we're a district that funds, or is funded, at 142% of adequacy this year, in looking at something if we were to say then expend or spend 100%, we'd have a bigger gap. So trying to tie our expenditures with our adequacy revenue, I think helps provide a little bit of a picture here. And really the way this is used is internally, we're a district that uses it, you know, as we look at staffing, as we look at where we are allocating resources for a given year, to see does it align to the strategic goals of the district. Then we have to look and say, okay, numbers that appear to be big outliers, why is that? Supervisory aides, our security team for the building is included in that. We've got a large security team because we are an in-house security team that covers a huge building. You know, that's a challenge that other buildings may not face here. Another one was school site staff at 291%, seems high, but given that our administrative offices are in the building, we've got all our department secretaries that get counted into that number to count for the employee count that throws our numbers versus a district that may be able to house them either at an administrative building or at another site. Another one that jumps off the page here is when we look at just at our special education spend, but we've got a very robust special education program here. Our site team that works with our students beyond age of 18 is extremely impressive, but requires a larger staff. So overall, what we found is we're at 142% of adequacy as defined by the state is for funding, and we're expending at 138%, which I think is what you would want to see, because I would imagine we were expending over that, we'd be in a deficit talk and would not have a strong financial backbone to our district. So you know, put that out for information. But if there's questions on this report, be happy to take them.
Okay, I asked this last year, but just to clarify again, what's the reason that the number of librarians and librarian aides are so far below the
Yeah.
the target?
You can jump in if you want.
This came up recently, hold on a second, let me look at it. Oh, this is gonna get mad. It's because of, it actually explains how it's calculated here, so, it's because they recommend, for grades 9 through 12, 1 librarian for every 600 students. Okay, so if you think about a high school that has 600 kids in it, or 1,200 kids, they'll have 2 librarians and that can manage, but the way our library functions, if we populate that out, do we need 6 librarians or 5 in a part-time group of librarians? We don't, we're able to run our library effectively with what we have. That doesn't mean we have any less services or books or ability to serve our students as they come into the library for different purposes. So it's simply just a matter of how to calculate the formula works for a school our size.
I also think one thing that you know, as we talk through this with our full administrative team, we have a library that really is a true student resource center. It serves so much more of a purpose than just media intake and outtake, but we have makerspace areas, we have classroom areas. So that means that space also has teachers. It's got yeah, and for a given period of time, our student help desk was there for technical support. You know, so if a student's Chromebook wasn't working, they could bring it there until that classroom was needed. So this space is filled with an adequate number of staff. It's not that we don't have enough staff in that space. It's just that we have to categorize the individual staff members. They wouldn't fall in as a librarian.
You know, you could also, to illustrate that point, take a look at the principal line immediately below that, right? So we only have 28% of the principal here at OPRF. Of course, that's not really true. We have one at Parker, so we have at least 150% principal. But you know that Yeah, that's just how far it works.
You don't need 6 principals.
No, we're good.
I think those would be some of these lines where, if you think about, you get out past suburban Chicagoland, and you start going out to high schools, yeah, okay, they want one librarian at least in high school, and so most of those high schools are probably 600 to 700
Yeah.
kids on average, so like that's again with the model. That should be pulled and used, this reports, would you pull these reports for every school district?
No,
They were supposed to be, I know they were supposed to be pulled, put to the,
yeah,
it is, he was supposed to have eventually.
There is an ISB variation, yes, I think, or at least there was for.
Wasn't there? Yeah, we had like a rate report and you can. Yeah. Cause I was gonna say, eventually, like, if you look at any school district in Chicagoland, they're all gonna be like librarian lines together. So I definitely know my high school, which is like 3,600 Naperville, did not have more than 2 librarians. They're about the same size population of students. Any other questions? Any future agenda items you can think of this time that you're want to discuss? As always, if there's something you think of, like when we walk out or something like Kathleen did last time, just email us, email me and Tony, and then we can discuss and figure out like a time frame to put it on the agenda and all that stuff. Not that this one, that anybody.
My topic is, would the committee consider meeting every other month instead of every quarter?
I used to be for every month and I got kind of thrown out the window on that one, so I'm for every other month.
Yeah, as I referenced earlier, I think the board would love to work more closely with CFC, get more out of it, make it more of a working type of committee, and that's the reason for that, so. That's my topic for consideration.
Yeah, we know your calendars and all that stuff.
Every month, just bring sandwiches.
See, yeah, they need a break. They only have to go twice a month to board meetings. So I want to project them to more meetings every night after work. And the normal school day. How do you get out there, right? And we should.
Appreciate it. Actually, Lisa needs those meetings. She comes.
You're right, she has to go more meetings, you guys do.
Goes there.
All right, can I get a motion to adjourn?
Motion.
And.
Karen, Kathleen, all in favor, say aye. Any opposed? No.
Has anyone ever opposed meeting?
Actually, not from the last meeting, different meeting do that. But it was only because it was his last meeting, so he's like, I post this meeting, so you're like. Later, next.
Well,
Listen, that's a long ways up.